Well, transparency is perhaps the most important aspect of the ethics of emerging technology. If we don't understand what's going on in a system, whether that's a human system or a technical system, we cannot hold people accountable, we cannot detect biases, we cannot ensure that people's privacy is being protected and that things are acting in fair and just manners.
Hello and welcome to a whole new episode of Engati CX. I'm your host Kingshuk, and today you folks are in for a treat. But before I introduce you to our guest, allow me to introduce you to the Engati platform. So Engati is the world's leading multilingual no-code digital CX platform, available across 14 channels with over 35,000 solutions created across 186 countries in pretty much every domain and use case. Engati has also been recognized as a top platform by Inc.com, TechWorld, CIO, and many others like that. So we run the Engati blog, video channel, and Engati CX podcast, receiving upwards of 400,000 visitors annually. And now for our guest today, Nell Watson. Very warm welcome, Nell. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here as well.
So for our listeners, I'll just give a quick introduction. So Nell serves as the Senior Scientific Advisor to the Future Society, as well as she is a Senior Fellow to the Atlantic Council and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. So her public speaking has inspired audiences to work towards a brighter future, and she has been on like the World Bank, United Nations General Assembly, and Royal Society, inspiring people in the field of AI and ethics. In sharing her knowledge as an AI faculty at Singularity University and as an author of machine intelligence courseware at O'Reilly Media, she realized the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and values of human spirit into AI. So it's a pretty interesting area that you are working in and researching and obviously inspiring a lot of people. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. So let's start off with something that has been a core of a lot of discussions. So how do you think we can bring around transparency into the field of AI, especially around the data we use for training or the biases that seem to creep in?
Well, transparency is perhaps the most important aspect of the ethics of emerging technology. If we don't understand what's going on in a system, whether that's a human system or a technical system, we cannot hold people accountable, we cannot detect biases, we cannot ensure that people's privacy is being protected and that things are acting in fair and just manners. Transparency, therefore, is the keystone of ensuring that technologies are ethical. I think that it's important to understand that technology doesn't exist on its own, or it's not deployed on its own. It always has organizations around it as well. And so purely technical solutions, whilst extremely important and extremely valuable, don't always give the whole picture. And so I recommend that the transparency of an organization and its processes and its culture is also very important, as well as the technology. Now, of course, in a world of flows of data across borders, across jurisdictions, between different systems, it can often be very complex and hard to understand just where data is going. For example, a news app on your phone might have 50 different trackers that are embedded within it, which are sending information all over the place.
Yeah.
How do you know where your information is going? How does the provider of that service even know what their data partners are doing? Those are very difficult questions. There are some technologies that we can deploy to increase transparency in data-driven systems. whether that's things like Shapley mechanics in machine intelligence, giving us a bit of a picture as to how an algorithm is functioning. Or we can do things like embed radioactive data, as Facebook Research calls it, which gives kind of a very slight change to data, which doesn't really affect how it operates, but it creates a kind of a steganographic signature that you can then pinpoint as that data moves around. And that can actually give you an early warning system if your data is showing up somewhere that you don't expect it to. So I think a blend of these new emerging technologies for understanding the flows of data, as well as good ethical rules in how to ensure transparency in organizations. When we bring the two of those together, I think that we can begin to ensure transparency within technical systems.
Yeah, definitely. So quite a lot of interesting concepts that you brought out here in terms of radioactive data and steganography. So how do you think like introduction of laws around GDPR and things have they really influenced or helped to sort of secure or make data more transparent? What's your take on that?
I think GDPR has been very influential, not only on influencing the legislature of other nations or other blocs, but also because by default, if anyone wants to do business with European customers, and Europe is a big market, they essentially need to figure out how to comply, or else risk losing out on a lot of commercial opportunities. So that's had kind of a chilling effect upon the whole world in a sense. However, it's also forced the whole world to up its game. And whilst there was quite a lot of skepticism about the value of GDPR, I think as the years have gone on, it seems as if GDPR has been of more value than a lot of people expected, especially because we're now starting to realize just how much power big tech has and just how difficult it is to rein in the big tech firms. And I think that there's a new wave of legislation coming to try to mitigate some of the excesses of big tech. And that legislation will be coming in within the next year or so in both the US and the EU, and probably in other nations as well, Canada, etc., Brazil, possibly India as well. And I think that's going to make things a little bit more tricky for the big tech companies. And I hope that burden lands largely on the larger firms and less on the smaller ones, because some of the stipulations, the hoops that need to be jumped through are rather resource intensive, you know, and so it's always a difficult balance of finding policy that works and yet is actionable and isn't too onerous. But I think it's very important that we curtail some of the power of big tech, especially because big tech itself has an effect not only on our economy, not only on other players in the market, particularly smaller players, but also upon our culture, upon politics, upon the polarization ongoing within society. Many different cultures of the world are experiencing that, and it's being significantly driven by social media and big tech algorithms.
Okay.
And so I think it's important that we ensure that these companies are working in ways that are, again, transparent, are fair, and aren't disenfranchising people from economic opportunities.
Yeah, very well said. I think, you pointed out well that, there needs to be a fine balance, because the legislation would be for all. And although we would want to focus on the big tech, it's like applicable across, and like we'll need to see how it influences the smaller players or how it works out. But good to learn that it has really helped in terms of transparency of data. So on that topic of transparency, another parallel discussion is around accountability of AI, right? And these systems. So how do you think we can make AI systems accountable? I mean, we come across news reports of, let's say, Tesla cars being in an accident. So how much of it is an organization liable versus can they just say that, no, it was just the system, or how does it really pan about?
Similarly to transparency, both are very important. Having accountability within an organization means that you understand who was genuinely responsible for that problem. And I really recommend that organizations have somebody nominally in charge of the ethics of that organization at the highest level, probably at the C-suite level, so that anyone in that company who has a concern can go directly to that person, rather than having to go through a manager or two who might, dismiss it or say, oh, well, we don't have time for this, or this is not important, etc. I think that's one of the biggest problems in the world right now, is lots of people see things and they're concerned about them, and they've no channel to get that redressed. Either it ends up being ignored until it eventually becomes a really huge problem, or else they're forced to become whistleblowers. But to become a whistleblower is usually the death of one's career. So that's quite a difficult step, and can actually put people in personal danger potentially as well, not just professionally. Within systems, there are ways that we can make systems more accountable. I think we should probably avoid the use of black box algorithms where they're not required. Quite often, an SVM or other kind of, say like a decision tree or something like that, which is simpler and often does almost as well as a sophisticated neural network. But of course, a decision tree you can audit, you can work backwards as to how a decision happened, how it was made, what were the predicates, the elements of an argument that made a decision happen inside that machine. And I think often there's a tendency to just throw deep learning at a problem, or throw big fancy neural networks that you can't easily peek inside because they are largely stochastic or random. Things don't always pass through them in the same way, and you don't always find a way to work back from the output to the input that you got. There are some technologies that can help you to peer inside neural networks, particularly things like convolutional neural networks. But it's still an area of active research and rather experimental. And we don't have that many ideal off-the-shelf solutions for this kind of problem. Mm-hmm. I think another important aspect is to keep very strong logs, to log as much data as possible, to flag data if it becomes degraded. So for example, if a sensor gets dirty and you can't necessarily trust that data that it's receiving is accurate, that data is flagged as being a little bit suspect, or that somebody comes after the fact and does a second check on it. And I think also it's important that we ensure that a decision which is made, that it's supposed to be made by a human, is made by a human, or if it's supposed to be made by a machine, is made by a machine. And we don't have machines filling in for humans but pretending to be humans because maybe there's a shortfall of staff, or we don't have human beings pretending to machines because maybe the machine learning isn't quite as sophisticated as it was supposed to be, or because somebody wants to influence something for a personal motive. So there are opportunities and also a lot of risks, and we do need to give a lot of attention to this area, I think, in the area emerging technologies.
Definitely. I mean, this entire field sort of changes the definition of a lot of things, and it's obviously very different from traditional software. And
Yes.
people obviously have their reservations around, is it the big monster that is like going to eat us all up, or is it can be controlled or managed? So yeah, I think some good points there. So, would it be fair to say that most of the algorithms in use today in this AI or machine learning fields are of a black box nature, or people are actively like focusing to change that scenario?
I think there is a tendency to throw whatever appears to be the best off the shelf solution. So, I mean, you can go to paperswithcode.com/SOTA and see all the state-of-the-art best benchmarked technologies in machine learning. And there's a tendency to just, lift those and start to apply them. But quite often, more traditional algorithms will work just as well if it's a simple problem. If you have a rather modest data set that you're working with to solve a rather relatively trivial sorting or recommendation algorithm or something like that, you don't need to get sophisticated.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're only probably spending a lot of extra compute time and maybe programming time as well, trying to get something to work that is overall less reliable, despite being more expensive. And the marginal value of using that more sophisticated technology might be a matter of a few percent of improvement, which probably isn't that important overall.
Yeah. So, how can we make progress in AI explainability? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, explainability is sort of the daughter of transparency. Transparency is a necessary prerequisite for explainability, but explainability goes a step further. So a system might be transparent if it spits out some sort of like error code, a sophisticated error code that tells you exactly why something happened or why something went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But if the end user cannot understand that error code, then it's not very useful to them. It's not very helpful. And so the essence of explainability then is to go a step further. It's to provide information in a way that people can easily understand, even those who are non-technical or kind of general public typical users. And of course, explainability can have several tiers. So you can have a simple explanation of something. You can enable somebody to drill down further. You can have restricted further drill down of explanation for auditors or for sysadmins, etc. And so by taking extra care to encode information in a way that people can easily understand, whether that's through infographics, pictograms, that kind of thing, we can make it a lot easier to understand why a system did something. And through doing so, we can empower people to better understand what technology is doing to and for them.
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of different aspects to it, and that is how, and it's a developing area and will progress out much better, hopefully, for all of us.
Very much so. It's still experimental, but progress is coming along all the time.
Correct. Yeah, that's always good to know. So I remember in the question of accountability, you mentioned machines pretending to be humans. So my next question is around that. So do you think that machines will ever be in a state to develop emotional quotient or feelings of that sort, or it will be just a logical system that is deriving responses from trained data?
I think it's probably not that challenging to do a rough approximation of emotions. I mean, at a very basic level, we have reptilian cortices in our brain that are based around fight and flight and mating and things like that. And those are very basic, very low level emotional impulses. But then we have the mammalian emotional cortex that's built upon that, like an expansion pack. And that gives us a sense of empathy for others. It gives us the ability to form complex social groupings and to understand the relations between those individuals. And I think there are a couple of necessary prerequisites, and I think we're getting towards that. So first off, we need to have machines which are sophisticated enough to have a believable conversation with someone. Yeah. And I think we have that with GPT-3. So this new technology, it was released by OpenAI about 2 months ago, I think. And that is a particularly sophisticated form of working with text. Right, and it's able to generate quite sophisticated conversations, which can be styled towards a number of different forms. And I think GPT-3 and its successors, and I think we'll have a lot of successors quite quickly, because we've shown that having a stupendous number of parameters gives a disproportional return, right? Deep learning was born from a realization that throwing lots of data at a problem and many layers to a neural network that could make sense of that gave unreasonably good returns. And now we've discovered that having massive models is unreasonably good. And so I think we're likely to see a GPT-4 or similar kinds of technologies within the next 6 to 12 months, which probably will be an order of magnitude more sophisticated, because it makes sense to throw a couple of $1 million just at training, because what you might get out of it could be truly revolutionary. So I think that's becoming almost a solved problem, at least to a degree. And those technologies can interface not only with text, but also with images as well. So you can use a transformer such as GPT-3 or similar technologies like that to make sense of an image using less compute time and less parameters than a convolutional neural network would, like a more traditional deep learning system. I think another aspect of creating a machine that at least can mimic emotions, if not necessarily feel them, is having the right data set of examples. And that's something I've been working towards myself with a project called ethicsnet.org, where we're collecting examples from many different cultures all around the world of what pro-social behavior looks like to them. So that's people doing things that are kind or preferable or orderly, whether that's in a textual form, pictures, or video. And so we can tag that, we can aggregate it into data sets. And through doing so, we can provide examples to AI so that they can better understand how to fit in to a specific society or culture. Just the same way that maybe a child of 5, we don't expect them to know right from wrong, but we already begin to socialize them that, if you're in a temple or a museum, try to be quiet. If you make some mess, try and clean it up. Those kinds of simple things like that. So I think with those two elements, we can begin to create systems that can act in ways which are more preferable. I think the simulation would be another level beyond that, a simulation of an emotional cortex. I think it'll probably be at least 5 years, a bare minimum, before we start to really see that. Although there are some companies out there that purport to make emotion chips for AI, but I haven't yet had a chance to examine those. But I think within 10 years, we can expect to have a halfway sophisticated emotional cortex for AI, I would expect.
Yeah, that would be some interesting times for sure for all of us. So GPT-3 definitely has been quite revolutionary in this space, and I mean, when it came out, we were all like fascinated by what it could do with all the data that it has been trained, and so easy to start up. I mean, you don't even need to be an expert to just start hooking into it and getting it to work. So yeah,
Yes, having it accessible as an API, although people can't play around with the model itself unless you're Microsoft, I suppose. It still does make it revolutionarily more accessible to people, and it means you can literally put together a new system in in an afternoon, potentially, if you know what you're doing, or a day or two at least.
yeah. So Nell, we initially spoke a lot about legislations around transparency, accountability, and obviously you have been on various councils and discussions. So what do you think? Like, is it too optimistic to assume that countries across the world can maybe come up with a definition of AI or its guidelines or things that it cannot do, or maybe around ethics as such? So what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously, like, legislations are different, people are different, leaderships are different. So how do you think these all will converge from a legal standpoint, let's say?
Well, there are probably about 90 to 100 different AI principles out there. And principles are useful because they don't tend to age. If we look at the Peelian principles of policing, they're getting towards 200 years of age. And yet those principles of how policing should be done with the consent of the community and all that kind of stuff are just as relevant as they were when they were written. So I think that's a beautiful thing, that principles can be indeed timeless. But how we action those changes a great deal. And I've done a lot of work myself with the IEEE to help to create standards as well as certifications, particularly in the age of transparency and also privacy. And some colleagues of mine have created certifications for accountability, as well as the mitigation of bias, as well as some standards around those as well, not just certifications. I've also been working with companies like CertNexus to create credentials for professionals working in that space, so that we can certify not only systems and organizations, but also the people working within them. And I think all of that is important, especially to keep an international scope, right? You know, to create systems, or to create, rules that can be applied in a number of different jurisdictions, a number of different cultures. But I do have some concerns about the ongoing cyber balkanization, if you will, that the internet, it seems to be in the process of splitting up. Russia, for example, has kind of created their own national internet, and they've created gates that they can switch at any time. China, of course, has had the Great Firewall for a number of years now. And even in the US, they are hinting that they might even block some traffic from China, etc. And so we might end up with a very fragmented internet. And yet at the same time, we have satellite networks such as Starlink and some other competitors too, that make it very difficult to police, whether somebody can access the wider net or not. So we live in interesting times. And I think that that this fragmentation is probably going to make things more difficult when it comes to aligning the world on safer and healthier AI regulations and rules.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of, I think, competition and safeguarding of IP and technology is definitely prevalent in these days. So yeah. So I guess the last question from my side, and I guess quite an important one, is there are so many students and young technologists that are venturing into this field, right? And we spoke about different concepts of transparency, accountability, ethics, and so on. So how do you think we should teach students to act or use these technologies in the most responsible way?
I think encouraging people to have courage and bravery is one of the most important aspects. It takes a lot of guts to be able to pinpoint that something looks a little bit unfair or a little bit suspicious, or that it could be done in a better way, whether that's a safety and security issue or an ethical issue. And it's difficult enough to do that as a manager in a company. It's far more difficult to do that as an intern. And yet, sometimes an intern or a student has pinpointed some kind of horrible issue that everybody else ignored. For example, there was a skyscraper built in New York City that if winds blew upon it from a certain direction, the whole skyscraper could collapse and it would destroy several blocks. And this building was built. It was up for several years. Thankfully, the weather wasn't dangerous in just the right way that it needed to be. But it was a student that was looking at that building and said, "Hey, wait a minute." And then their professor called up the architects that built it and said, "Wait a minute." And then they had to rush and very quietly retrofit the building to be stronger. But if that person, if that student hadn't discovered that issue, then eventually the building might have collapsed and it might have killed thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes just having somebody's eyes on the problem, like you never know who's going to be the person that spots that critical issue.
Yeah.
And so I think encouraging bravery within people working within emerging technologies, as I said before, creating channels for people to go straight to the top of the company, creating ombudsmans or like organizations that employees can take their observations to if the management still isn't listening. I think that's another important aspect.
Yeah.
As well as teaching the importance of ethics within technology fields. I think that's something that's so important, because we're living in a world today where we can do so much. There's so much unlimited potential, and emerging technologies like AI are the closest thing to magic in the world right now.
Yeah.
And it's often not a case of can we do it, because we usually can, or if we can't now, we will in a year or two. But it's a case of should we do it? You know, is it fair? Is it just? Might there be a better way? Those are the real questions of our time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, bravery is quite an important term. I mean, it doesn't usually come up, but yeah, I mean, with definitely the anecdotes you gave, it seems to be quite an important aspect as well. Yeah. So on that note, I mean, any other comments or thoughts that you would like to leave our audience with around these topics that we spoke about, or even anything else?
I just recommend that people give as much thought to these issues as they can. And yeah, I suppose if I can recommend that people have a look at things like ECPAS, ECP AIS, some of the work that I've done with the IEEE. And we have a version of that we created for contact tracing technologies, the app viral exposure technologies. And those are public domain or Creative Commons. So you can go and have a look at those for free, etc. And I suppose if anyone in that space is interested in earning a professional credential in this area, there's a company called CertNexus that create the Certified Ethical Emerging Technologist credential that I contributed towards, as well as the courseware for that. So I think the more people that we get engaged in helping to keep technology ethical and safe, we'll have a much better chance of building towards a better future.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's great to learn, the diverse range of work you have been doing in this field. And I'm pretty sure our audience will learn a lot more about these dimensions of AI and emerging technologies. So yeah, so thank you so much, Nell, for giving us your time. Your insights, your work, your anecdotes have been really valuable, and I'm sure our audience is going to love this interview.
Thank you. It's been a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you. So we will be back with a new episode with a brand new expert soon. So stay tuned and hope all of you will be there to join us as well. Thank you.